Hi everyone, in this video we'll be providing some art suggestions for this great looking game which was posted by Joe Marks from superbeefy.net on a Facebook page I belong to that's aptly named Pixel Art. I thought this work in progress game was looking really charming and like a lot of fun, but I saw some opportunities to discuss some critical aspects of color usage that we think could make the game look even better. We asked Joe for permission to use his game art and footage for this video. We'll place links in the description so you can learn more and follow the project on social media. And one thing I really liked about what they're doing with the game is the attention they were paying, or the extra work they were putting into making nice little details like the birds that really help bring life to the environment. And as you mentioned earlier, just the nice cute animations of the character waking up from sleeping, blinking and stretching their arms. They've got a nice amount of layered scrolling. And one of the other nice little touches that I noticed elsewhere in the game, let's see if I can find it fairly quickly. If not, I can always edit the video to get to that point. I think it was around the 4-minute mark. Do you remember the guy with the
I think if it's like in like a town scene, somewhere in the middle of the video.
Oh yeah, okay, so 5 it was. All right, somewhere in around this area. Here he is. Okay. So I like this dude here. I like the little bounce to his feather when he bounces there. When he runs, he holds his hat on his head like there's actual wind resistance in this world. Those little touches that add personality to the character and just create a more realistic sense that that this is a world that exists, that there's even very superficial potential consequences to actions. He's not just running, he's running and holding his hat, which is obviously a fairly important aspect of his character design. It even brings more attention to that special aspect of the character, and he's holding it on his head while he's running. I thought stuff like that were just really nice touches.
Yep.
It's really looking like a very charming game. There we go with butterflies now as opposed to birds. So yeah,
I enjoy too, like there's a couple parts where she opens a treasure chest and she just kind of bangs it, I think, and it opens up and like all the coins just kind of spill out on the ground. Like it's a nice little
right.
You know, it's a bit chaotic, but it really, I don't know, it's unique compared to, you know, most games. They're just gonna have like a simple little
right
here's your thing, you know, pop up.
Right.
But
absolutely. Oh, she has to catch frogs, I think that's why she has the net. Has she done it yet? I didn't notice. I wasn't watching the video. Like she grabbed she got a net from the NPC character there, and
oh yeah.
So she, for some reason, like there's like a little mini quest or something where she has to capture frogs. And I know the first time I watched the video, I saw her catching frogs, which was really cute, but I didn't catch it this time. It may have gone right in front of my face, and I just was looking over at OBS at the moment. But so in general, just the game is looking fantastic, and it is still a work in progress, so everything is open to change, and we're hoping to provide some useful feedback today. But yeah, it's just really looking like a very fun and charming game. So now on to the actual suggestions that we have that could potentially improve the overall visual appeal of the game. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was sort of important knowledge for how color and atmosphere work, which is really important for creating the illusion of depth and distance in especially in landscapes, especially outdoors where there is typically, if you're on Earth, atmosphere. And the really great trick for anyone to know that is a landscape painter or even a digital artist, if you're going to be drawing environments and you want a really nice sense of depth, there's a really easy sort of formula or trick you can use to get those perfect colors for stuff in the background to really get that really nice sense of depth. And it's something that a lot of artists struggle with before they learn this trick. and it's something I learned, in my youth when I started getting into oil painting and acrylic painting of landscapes and things like that. So the idea is you take the average color of the sky, and so for example, here we have this big tree here in the foreground. So if that's the actual color of the tree, if you are right up near it, the way to make that, to push that tree into the distance, is to actually take the colors of the tree and mix them more and more with that averaged sky color. The more of the sky color you mix into the color of the trees, you have that exact same tree color literally pushed back further into the distance. And if you think about it, that's really what's happening. The farther something is away from you, like we think of air as completely transparent, but the sky is nothing but, a very massive amount, a very massive depth of these tiny little particles and gas that actually refract and reflect light and tend to reflect, in the daytime, blue shades more than anything else. So you can almost think of it as like, imagine for every let's say tenth of a mile or something, think of adding another semi-transparent sheet of this light blue color, the sky color, right, in this case, right? So that's actually, so you would just, the further and further back something is, the more of that color that you add. So, and that, so if you have a sunset where the sky is very red, things would actually get redder, as more and more red as they went to the background, which works perfectly well, even though in general and in the daytime, the general rule you want to follow is you want your background colors to look more blue, and as the colors come forward, as objects are closer to you, you want the colors to be more warm and more saturated. So did you have something you wanted to add to that, Corey?
Yeah, just that, I guess you could say there are two ways to fix this scene.
Right.
One would be, yeah, like leaving the sky sort of similar to this, because it's obvious with the sky color, like this is supposed to be broad middle of the day,
Right.
like a nice kind of clear day, and
Right.
You can take all of these foreground elements and adjust them accordingly, or if
Right.
you really did want these more yellowish, warmer colors in the landscape, you could take the sky and shift it into
Right.
something more suitable for that, like a sunset type setting or something like that. But
Right, exactly.
obviously, even still, some of the values would probably still need to be adjusted here and there to
Right.
get it just right. You know what I mean?
Right. So that's what we did ahead of recording this video. Is Joe was nice enough to provide us with some screenshots, and so here is that same environment as it stands in the current game demo. And so what we did is we followed those actual sort of rules of natural atmosphere and color for creating that nice illusion of depth, and we just started toying with things. And I might be able to get away with doing this in promotion to some degree, just to show you what I mean. Yeah, it's only affecting that narrow band, but you could see it's immediately going to fall into the distance if we make it much more similar to the actual sky color. So that really makes it look like what would be, green hills and things like that, just
Yep.
pushed really far into the distance. And then I can try to do the same thing here with these colors, which are very warm still. So, something like that. And then the highlight color is also important. Got another color to adjust here. So with those sorts of colors, you could see how it makes it look much more natural under that particular sky, and it really helps separate the back from the foreground. It just gives you that actual atmosphere and that actual depth. And like Corey had said, it's absolutely fine if you want to go the opposite route. If you want these foreground colors to really make sense and to have a nice cohesive environment and atmosphere, the other option would be to go the opposite route and change the sky colors to go with that sort of color scheme. So, you know, it would be more of a sunset-y kind of colors. And these sort of color banding is making it much more difficult to make the example changes, but let's see here.
Yeah, and I would say even though that's an option, like I would say that the sky being the color it is was so like I would assume, you know,
right,
I don't
exactly.
like to make too many assumptions, but I would assume like his intention is to make this like a nice kind of pretty day scene, you
right.
know, as for sort of his intro to the character, I guess.
Right.
Which, you know, makes sense. Which is, of course, once you see the other edited image, you'll see like the difference it makes. But
so anyway, anything like in this, if you could sort of focus on this area here, this color scheme, this kind of sky makes a lot more sense with these foreground colors now. But as Corey was saying, if someone establishes this sky, then they certainly, typically you draw the sky to represent the time of day and general atmosphere that you are going for. So to show you what we did with it, you know, we took more time and we adjusted all the colors in the environment to just really create that nice, just the nice, very distant, muted colors that give you a really nice sense of depth, and really help the foreground objects and foreground itself just really stand out more, and there's a much more natural feeling of depth where, as I mentioned before, I think blues automatically, psychologically, blue shaded colors automatically fall back into the distance to the human mind and the human eye, and warm and strong contrast and saturated colors automatically come forward in depth. So unless you're going very specifically for a sunset, it's nice to follow those rules and you'll just have a much better sense of depth. So aside from that, for this particular image, there were a few other suggestions that we had that we wanted to get to, and one of them was the idea of the and another thing that I should mention is in the original, the coloring of a lot of objects, but especially the tree and the tree trunk here, is extremely sharp contrast. There's quite light lights and really dark darks and a black outline. And in general, I mean, there's a lot of color and a lot of layers going on here. So right now there's a little bit of a tug of war or a clash going on between the pure black background against a lot of things, or pure black outline, I meant. I don't know what I said. But and the fact that there's otherwise plenty of colors on screen. So our suggestion would be to take the time, and as you can see what we did up here on the top of the tree, is instead of having a pure black outline around the entire tree, up here where their colors get lighter, actually use those darker green colors in the case of the tree leaves, and then here we switch to the medium green to make that out. It still has an outline, it's just more subtle, and that way it helps keep the environment as the beautiful world that sets a nice atmosphere and environment for the action to take place, but it no longer distracts the player. It no longer has as sharp contrast as the playable character and the objects that you can actually interact with. And you can see we did the same thing with these bushes here. which just really helps soften the environment, make it feel more natural and atmospheric, and just really make the game not only look nicer, but make it better for gameplay, because now the player can more instantly spot the important things in the game, the actual things you can interact with, and the player, and see what's going on. And then the other thing, just a general other thing that happens a lot with, in general, especially if you're working on a daytime scene, but anything, just about any situation. There's a quote attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. He said, "Look for blue in all shadows," and that basically means when you're creating a gradient for almost any color from light to dark, you don't want it to have the same exact hue and intensity across the entire spectrum from light to dark. In general, you'll have a much prettier game that looks much more natural if your lighter colors are getting a bit warmer, have a little bit more yellow or red or orange to them. And then, so even if, like, let's say you have objects in the game that are neutral gray, even in real life, almost no part of that image, if you took a photo or did a painting of it, would actually be pure neutral gray. The highlight colors, especially in sunlight, would appear a bit warmer, and then the shadowed colors would appear a bit bluer. So keep that in mind when you're making ranges of color. And another very common mistake in color and shading by a lot of artists is to keep the dark color just as saturated and just as warm for things that are like brownish. And if you go outside and look at actual trees, or Google them and look at tree trunks, they're a lot more gray than people think. You know, we grow up coloring tree trunks brown, but they're a very gray, muted brown. And some aren't brown at all, some are gray, like birch trees and stuff like that. But the point is, it's going to look a lot nicer and more natural if you add a lot more, if you mute those shadows, if you make them less saturated and add a lot more blue. And then I would also lighten this color, just reduce that contrast. Even more, a little bit more, lighten that up. And that's just going to make a much more natural looking, more pleasant color in general for the tree trunk, and make it less contrasty and less sort of fighting for your attention. It's going to help the character stand out more, and just give you an overall a nicer look, which is, as you can see, what I did here. Were there some other things, Corey, that I'm forgetting that we wanted to talk about with this first image?
I believe there was something with this sort of taller grass.
Yes,
that's,
down here. Yep.
Being used down there. How it, would kind of go in front of the bushes a little bit, but then kind of stop there.
Yeah.
It was unclear. Like it makes it look like the grass has almost been landscaped to be perfectly, like, put in that spot.
Right.
So it either needs to
Right.
keep going across in front of the bush, or you could pull the bush maybe in front of the grass to make a clear separation of where they are in depth. Whereas right now they kind of just run bumping into each other, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. They're literally, especially right here where they intersect, they're fighting over the same physical space.
Right.
So let me turn this off. So, and what I mean by that, if you look in a 2D game, if there's a tiny bit of perspective, even a small amount, showing depth on the top surface of the ground area, which this has, the way you can tell how far back something is if it's on the ground is the pixel height of the bottommost pixel. So obviously, if a character is sitting here, like, she's sitting on this grass. Oh, wow. I just had a realization, Corey.
Yeah.
What's happening there? Because I was fooled by the static screenshot. We should look back at the video. I think what's happening is everything is behind. She never appears on top of this, like down here, which is what I
Right.
thought was happening. Like this ground always overlaps everything, so it is it's like a straight on side view. And I
Right.
guess the reason I didn't take it that way is because this is so undetailed. Like usually, if you saw like a cross section of a ground that was overlapping the character, you would actually see the sort of side view of the grass
Right.
as it overlaps the character.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think that that sort of band of light color,
yeah,
uh, it does give the illusion that it's got that sort of depth ground to it,
yeah, that's what I
because
thought
it's
was
so
happening.
bright, at
Right.
that top,
Yeah,
and it's so thick.
I thought what was going to happen just by the screenshot. I thought when she stood up, she would kind of come down lower
Hmm.
and be standing sort of like this, and that was the top surface of the ground. But now that I'm looking at it, I should. I'm surprised I did not notice when I was. So let's play this and zoom in and see what's happening here. But yeah, even the birds are back there.
Yeah, it could just that could be a simple matter of maybe just tweaking the ground tiles,
Yeah. Oh, that gets
adding that
fast.
little bits of detail they need.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that changes a little bit of the little bit of the feedback that.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I would just and it looks pretty. It looks pretty decent the way it is. It might be worth since you have it from a technical standpoint capable of overlapping her. It might really pay off to have some like actually obvious blades of grass that come up and overlap in front of her, and that's going to really make it obvious what's happening. That
Yeah.
that is like a foreground that comes in front of her. And even if you don't do it anywhere, just in a few spots, I think would just look really nice and would really, and then just make this a little more pointy in general. And then occasionally have like these, much taller blades of grass that come up. And you can decide how detailed to make it down here. It can work the way it is, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It just takes the right shape on top.
Right.
It just kind of has this like very very even.
Yeah, I
slight
really thought it
bumpiness
was
to
a.
it, which yeah.
I thought it was a floor surface, like a lot of games. It's not perfect straight on. There's like you see a little bit of the depth of the ground, and then the character's feet are kind of halfway on that top surface. But if I had watched the video more carefully, I would have noticed that wasn't the case. But yeah, that's my new suggestion based on the realization, is give it the occasional nice tall blades of grass to make the overlap really obvious, and to make it more obvious that this is indeed, even if it's short grass, make it more obvious that it's grass as opposed to a flat ground surface. So what one thing we were going to suggest before is casting a shadow of this background grass, but now that makes no sense whatsoever because we thought that this was sort
Right.
of a flat ground surface. So, all right, so let's see, going back to this. So that all makes sense now. However, it is still, now that I know that that's the case, what I would suggest is, so what's interesting is you've got the tree, the grass, and the bushes. Because of this sort of perfect side perspective, it's a little hard to tell what's in front of everything. So that those same color rules are going to come in really handy. Whereas if you darken and blue out the grass, that's going to work well. And then, so I'll just scribble over this to bring back the bushes. So now you can make those bushes in front of that grass. I would not make the grass in front of those bushes because the bushes are brighter and warmer colored.
Yeah, it
so
almost
the bush
seems
should be in
like
front of the grass.
yeah, it almost seems like the row of grass back there should just be all the way across behind everything.
Exactly.
It never
Exactly right.
stop, or
Right.
you know what I mean? Like it just needs to be
Right.
like that's how I would do it if
Right.
I was drawing this.
Yeah,
Because then
see-
it just
see,
looks
look-
like a natural element
Right.
of the background,
Right. So this looks a lot more natural. And then if you really want to make the environment even more lush and make even more sense, you could theoretically take more of this dark color and add like the occasional even further back bush, you know, detailed and shaded in the same way, but with the darker, more muted colors. And that's going to give you a nice sense of depth in general. So, you know what I mean? So you've got, now you don't have like this, like it would look a little weird in nature if all the grass was exactly the same height in a straight horizontal line. So you can, you know, make it a little shorter in some places.
Yeah.
Put a
add
nice
some variation.
Put a nice bush back there. And then, you know, the biggest, obviously, by far the most important thing was getting the proper color balance based on the actual atmosphere and the actual depth based on the sky. And so you're going to end up with just not only something that looks more pleasant, like even though most people don't understand these rules or why colors look that way in depth, they know when it's wrong. They know when they're seeing colors that don't match, that don't work well or properly together. And like I said, the most important thing is you've got all this really nice parallax scrolling in this game, and it's being the sense of depth is really being contradicted or fought against by the color scheme, because there's so many very warm colors in the original in the background here.
Yep.
So it just really flattens it out. And again, the other thing, so not just color, but pay attention to contrast, because if you have background elements that are almost as high contrast as the foreground elements, and you have like just environment stuff that you don't really interact with is every bit as high contrast and with the black outlines as the important playable characters and stuff, it's just going to further not only flatten out the game a little bit, but it's less functional as a game, because the things that should be just sort of there and pretty and setting the mood are now like calling for your attention every bit as much as the actual objects you can interact with. So the other thing that we had discussed a little bit is it would definitely be worth it in the, oops, I don't know what I'm doing with my own program here. It would definitely be worth it to there we go. Since you have that mid layer of currently only grass, I mean, this is obviously a very lush environment with plenty of very nutritious soil. So it makes sense if you've got those grassy fields that there would be trees back there as well. So you could literally take this current tree and then blue out its colors and reduce its contrast and shrink it a bit. Let's see. Do Shift C, something like that, and then I'll just stamp it down into the background. But then I will. Apparently, black was a background color, but that's no big deal. Let's see, mode. Where's translucent? There it is. Paint mode. There's another tool. Where's the opacity? There it is. I haven't used this in a while. This feature, I mean. Oops. Oh, paint single color mode. It's going to take a few steps. Paint single color. This is a situation where Photoshop would be easier. Oops. Yeah. So how am I going to do this? I'll do a new layer.
Yeah, that would work.
All right, so there it is. So now I can grab it and then go back here and mode transparent or translucent, I mean, and then set that to something more like 20%. Well, it needs to be darker and bluer. Nope, that's not working either. Oh, that's right, because it's a brush. Darn it. Hold on. Mode.
Get it together.
I know, really. This is embarrassing. I use this program nonstop every day of my life, and let's see. So paint single color, and let's pick a darker bluer color here. There we go. Grab it, and then mode translucent. There we go. That's the right idea.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that would just really increase, it would make sense, and it would further increase that sense of depth. But I think that's about it for this particular environment. And you could see that's this is the original tree colors that you guys had under that blue sky. And you can now see very well how unnatural that looks, now that everything else is color corrected to be appropriate to be under this sky. It makes it more obvious how incorrect that was, assuming that it was supposed to be a fairly standard green-leaved tree.
Right. This could be an alien planet for all we know.
But I mean, in general, like, you've got this really lush world, and you've got these birds and all this life. And
yeah, I get the sense that that's what was trying to be conveyed by this scene. You know, like you know, a pretty scene with, you know, nice time of day. Yeah, so you got to have the right colors and tones.
I mean, basically, under that sky, if that's supposed to be a normal, healthy tree, it kind of looks dead. You know what I mean? Like, its colors are like really
it's got muted. A little bit of that.
It's a zombie tree a little bit. So.
Yeah.
But that would work perfectly under a red sunset sky. It would look like a normal, healthy tree, because the orange sky would make a normal, healthy green tree look that color. That's how the whole atmosphere and reflected and refracted light stuff affects things. So anyway, as you can see, like, this is all color palette changes, and it's just looking absolutely beautiful. So there's that, and then so moving on, here is an interior environment, and it's the same sort of rules. Obviously, there's way less depth and less atmosphere to worry about for depth. So now you have to, but you still use the same rules because it still has the same psychological effect for creating a sense of depth. And you really want to separate the important objects from just the sort of environment and atmosphere. You want the characters to really show beautifully no matter what they're doing. You never want the player to be able to sort of lose sight of where the character is and what they're doing. So it really helps to sort of make sure the contrast isn't too high in the background and stuff like that. So I can show, this is the edit we were working on. And from a color standpoint, you could see we slightly muted the brick color and made it more toward magenta or lavender, so that there's a bit more of a contrast with the wood wall color, but we also desaturated that a bit too. Or not desaturated, but made it we made it more of a pink brown than a green brown, if that makes sense, and lightened it a little bit. And then you could see that the big thing is when you have background elements like this, especially a repeating pattern, it can become far too attention-getting if you've got a strong highlight color and a strong shadow, especially right near each other, which obviously you do for things like wood paneling. So it really helps to make that contrast far less strong. So now you can still see that it's wood paneling, but it's not screaming at you, I am a panel of wood. You know what I mean? Like, calm down, panel of wood. You're not that important, you know? You're there to be nice, a nice environment. You're not there to distract me from the object that I need to pick up or the enemy or the character I need to talk to. So it just really helps the important stuff pop. And in general, like, you know, this presumably this woman is like a wizardess or a witch or something like that, and she probably sells potions or whatever. And she's important, and this looks like both her home and her sort of shop that she sells stuff out of or something. So, just a softer, more pastel color scheme just really makes us feel like a much nicer, more welcoming place.
Right.
And then the other really important thing, which was not just color, although there are other color choices that we made here, just to add more interest and to tie things together better. Corey had the great idea of making these bricks. If you notice in the original, hold on, that's not the original. In the original here, it was all the same gray, but Corey had the good idea of making the bricks of this part of the chimney match the bricks of the foundation there, and that just adds it ties the colors together better, and it just makes things look even more pleasant and interesting without being distracting. And then in a similar way, you could see this is not just a color change, but here you have presumably an active flame against a shiny metal cauldron. So it would be nice to get some reflected warm color into the bottom of that cauldron, which is not only does it make it pretty, but again, you're tying into those sort of lavender colors of the brick, which is it's adding more color overall to the background, but simultaneously color coordinating everything to make it just flow and work nicely and just look more pleasant. Mm-hmm. And then, as you can see, another important change we made was everything was very close to a pure neutral gray here. So we made the backmost wall pattern lower contrast, darker and more bluish. That way we can make higher contrast, warmer colored grays for the stuff that's supposed to be closer to the viewer. So that's what we did here. And then the brightest by far should be the actual floor. That is a solid obstacle that you interact with. You can land on it. So that should really show out at an instant glance in any platformer-like game. It should be super obvious what is a wall that will stop you and what is a floor you can land on. So we emphasize that with the careful controlling of contrast. And that's the most important thing as far as color. Can you think of any color-related things that should be mentioned?
One other thing we did here is once we started adjusting like the floor grays and the grays in the bottom, we noticed that the door back there and the fireplace still had a little bit too much of a brightness and contrast to them. So I think we neutralized those a little bit too, just to push them a little further back. Yeah. Right.
Again, just too much of a pure neutral gray, and that highlight is so strong right next to that pretty much pitch black stroke outline color that they're just too attention getting, too loud in contrast compared to the really important stuff. So that, as you can see, the highlight color is far less bright, and the stroke, the outline color, is now a dark gray instead of black or almost black. These bright highlights here that still exist, that's just an accident of my quick editing. I would have made this color if I had spent more time. That's a little too harsh. If there was a bright flame here, it would make sense to have such a strong light reflection color there. But so as you can see, it helps keep it. It's nicely detailed. It hasn't lost any detail, but it's lower contrast now, so it just goes into the background more, and it fulfills its role in a more pleasant way as just creating this nice looking lush world to explore.
One thing I would kind of notice looking at this too, that we didn't really adjust is, all the really bright white colors that are in like that crystal ball and those objects around the characters.
Yeah. I would tone that down too.
Yeah, that could possibly be toned down just a little bit to be pushed back a little further as well, because they are fighting with the characters there.
Right. Unless they were items like this little potion bottle. If they're items you can actually like jump up and grab or buy or something, it might be worth keeping them full contrast, like they are. But we could definitely tone down these things. I can do it in a kind of quick and
And
dirty way.
and that's not a that's not a horror, like it's not like it's horrible looking or anything. It's just
Right.
I kind of noticed that look, just centering my view on the scene of the characters. It's like your eye is really drawn to that crystal ball up there.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I don't know if it's important or not. Maybe something happens with it in the game. I don't know, but
Right.
and that if that's a possibility,
Right. So yeah, I'm going to just pick and this might be too much, but just to get the idea across that, yeah, this is too much, but darkening them really can help them just be in the background. That's too much. Actually, there's a brightness feature that might do a better job. Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah, just a very subtle shift down.
Just tone it down a bit so
Push
it's
them back,
not
yeah.
as bright and high contrast as the characters. It definitely would look nicer. Yeah. Now they're back there where they belong. They're not fighting for attention. They're not like they're currently so bright they almost feel like they're floating in the same distance from us as the characters, or approaching that. Whereas if
Right.
you just darken them a bit and reduce their contrast a bit, they're going to fall back nicely. And then if this is a crystal ball, it can definitely be darker because it's against darker colors, and crystal balls tend to be transparent or translucent at least.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this could be darkened a bit as well, and maybe even tinted to reflect more of the colors that are around it. If you want to like just push it back a little bit into the background as a nice looking prop, but not something that's fighting for attention with the really important stuff. And then the other color thing that I should mention is I made this shadow area, this dark entrance. It was originally also a very neutral gray, and remember, look for blue in shadows, look for blue for distance. So really pop what's going on inside that doorway into the background. You could see what a nice effect it was to just make that much a bluer grays. And it just really feels like there's a lot more distance in there. And then from an actual art tweak standpoint, the thickness of this doorway was a little extreme. So we, oh yeah, there's the original. I think, yeah, here's the original. So the thickness of the doorway was a little extreme. So we narrowed that down, and we didn't take the time to do so, but it would also make sense. Oops, F2. It would also make sense to not make that shadow so big now that it's not protruding so much. It would not cast such a big shadow.
Right.
But that's the idea. And then, oh yeah, the other really important thing you'll notice is in the original, the artist took their time to add this sort of sideways isometric perspective to give depth to the doorway, the chair, and these crates, but then did not do that at all on the bookshelves and the bed, and especially and the table, which really, really flattens out those objects and make them look like sort of cardboard cutouts. So I highly recommend taking the time. It's especially easy with the bookshelves. Like, as you can see, you just add that edge there and extend this edge out a little bit more that way, and then just add this drop shadow under that bookshelf. And then the same thing with those books. They were originally facing perfectly forward. Where's that original? There it is. So they look almost like candles without wicks. Because, like if other things with depth are going to have that perspective, you need to apply it universally, and you'll get just a much better sense of dimension to everything. So definitely take the time to give that same sense of dimension to the bed and the table, and at the very least cast those drop shadows under the bookshelves, and then I think it's looking much, much better. So I think that's it in general for really specific color advice and just sort of explaining those ideas to keep in mind for helping to really make the environment pleasant but not distract from the players, making sure the contrast, especially of the highlights and the outlines, aren't too strong compared to the highlights and outlines of actual objects and players in the wall and floor. So I think that's about it for our feedback in that regard, but there are sort of a broader concept that we wanted to bring up. And that is the idea of basically when you're creating the visual style for your game, you're not just drawing specific things and going, okay, like this is the general proportions of the character and this is the general fashion sense. You're creating what should be fairly hard, very strict rules for the overall aesthetic of the game, how things are rendered, whether or not things, have a pure black outline, or if so, what things do. Like when could or should that rule be broken? Like establishing all of those rules and making them really sort of concrete in your mind, or making that known. So in a lot of big studios, what will happen is like an art director or lead artist and concept artists, they'll spend anywhere from days to weeks working, just constantly iterating in concept art and mock-ups to nail the visual style for the game, and then they'll actually make a document with images and text that is the style guide that explains to all the artists to get them on the same page, like, either you always have black outlines, or you never do, or you only do for characters and not for environment. All of those sort of rules. And then, like, if you're going to do shading, like, is it cell shading, where it's pretty much just a solid, like, like a medium color and then a highlight color? Or is it, if it's more thoroughly shaded, in general, how many steps from light to dark there are going to be? All of those sorts of things, and even general sort of how color schemes are handled, all of that would be in the style guide. So even if you're making your own game, you don't have to actually write a document, but it's really good to sort of have these rules sort of concrete in your mind, figure out what you're doing. And that doesn't just pertain to the way you draw things and the way you color things, but in video games it also pertains to what sort of technical features of the game engine that you're going to use. So what's tricky about retro games is very often you can accidentally create this sort of juxtaposition of some things looking 8-bit in style, some things looking 16-bit in style, and then on top of all that superimposing very modern 24-bit looking, like alpha blended special effects, particle effects and stuff like that. And it's really easy for that to not look good. It's really easy for that to clash, especially to people that grew up with retro games, which is going to be a big part of the audience for a retro game, is going to be people that love retro games because that's the sort of game they grew up with and it's a nostalgic thing. So especially some people that are a potential audience are going to be more sensitive. Like old farts like me and Corey here, we're going to be more sensitive to, we're going to find it more jarring when there's a game that overall looks like it was made to emulate the technical constraints to a large degree of like a Sega Genesis or a Super Nintendo or something, and then suddenly in one level out of seemingly nowhere there's like all these 24-bit alpha blended special effects going on. So it's just a thing to keep in mind. It can be done tastefully, it's just hard, and it can be done without it being clashy. It just takes quite a bit of effort. And the other thing to keep in mind, I do suggest, no matter what decision you make, if you're allowing for certain types of more modern effects in your retro style game, try to make sure it's used cohesively and it doesn't feel just like sort of an afterthought added at the last minute to add, like a sort of easy way to add a little bit of pizzazz or polish to your game. Take the time to be really careful with how you're using these effects. And if at some point the game says, oh yeah, we can do this, we can have 24-bit glowing stuff and particles, then it's a good idea to work that in where it makes sense, everywhere that it then makes sense, right? So I'm going to go back to the video in this case. And
yeah, it goes just to add to
ahead.
that, like it adds to the, what you said, which is like establishing rules. So if you're going to use the effects in that way,
Right.
you sort of have to establish the rules for them. Is it going to be weird to see it used all over the place? Not if it's persistent everywhere.
Exactly.
But if it's not going to be everywhere, then there needs to be a reason that it's only used in very specific places. So
Right. So, like, as an example, okay, so here you have candle flames,
mhm.
right? And just in general, even if you go the old retro art way, I should have paused that 1 second. It would be really nice to draw and maybe even do like a 2 or 3 frame animation of like a circular glow on the background brick, and it could even be like I said, animated a little, just to make that flame illuminate the wall that it's right near. It'll be a nice additional bit of polish to the game. However, if later on in the same game, so you could see the first environment, there is virtually no special effects, sort of 24-bit effects to the human eye, although we did notice there is actually an effect being applied that you can see much more readily in a later level. So it's kind of good that you're using the same sort of, you've established a rule that these effects are allowed, and you're using them in more than one place, but it's virtually invisible here in this environment. And then when we get to the other environment, I'll show what it is, and then we'll pop back here. But you could see this looks very much between 8 and 16-bit. There's too many layers of scrolling by far to be 8-bit, but the black outline aesthetic on most of at least the foreground art gives it more of an 8-bit style. And then, but the amount of scrolling is up towards 16-bit or even later generation than that. But there's no visible like alpha blending or particle effects really going on. And it was the same thing in that internal environment. But later on in the game, and it takes a while, so keep that in mind. Like, people are going to be playing for many, many minutes, and then suddenly they're going to get to another environment, this cave here. Let me maximize it. Oh, well, this is a swamp, not the cave. So, but now we get semi-transparent water, but this was done in a way that makes perfect sense for 16-bit. It's just a solid semi-translucent color. So that fits very well. That's not jarring at all. And in fact, if you wanted to, it would look really nice to create a little water line, a brighter color.
Mm-hmm.
Right at the top, and you could make it wave just a tiny, tiny bit. Since this is obviously very kind of stagnant water, you wouldn't make a big consistent wave, but you could get away with just a very subtle bit of movement on a water line there, which would also really help when the character goes into the water. But that works well. That's like a 16-bit sensibility. But here we are in the cave now, and suddenly we've got this 24-bit fog effect over the entire background. And what we noticed is something extremely similar is actually happening in the very first environment, but it's turned down so subtly you almost can't see it. So this is a part of the game where, like, the person's been playing maybe, okay, so we're like 8 minutes in, before someone starts seeing, suddenly the game has a lot of 24-bit effects happening all over the screen, which looks fine. It looks nice, but just keep in mind, if you're going to set up that rule, suddenly the water being one, or seeming to be one solid semi-transparent color, suddenly that sort of seems out of place. Because if you can do the full 24-bit effects all over the screen for fog and anything, and everything like that, then theoretically you could have fancier effects for the water where you could actually have like a distortion ripple effect, or at the very least, like we said, like we were talking about, the sort of water line on the top being a brighter color with a little bit of animation, at the very least, and then maybe even like little particle effect water bubbles coming out. You have to decide, do I want to go that far with everything that is an effect that's semi-transparent, or do I maybe want to tone down the stuff that I had put in there later on in the game that suddenly is drastically more 24-bit in style? Let's see. Go ahead, Corey. You had something to say?
And this isn't necessarily related to effects, but one thing I really noticed about this cave is, you've got sort of the very background, and then you've got, and by the way, I really do love all these like root like things coming out.
Awesome.
They're very well, very nicely drawn. I like that stuff. But the sort of like in between the very back, that middle ground set of tiles that has sort of the cave, background to it.
Oh, this here.
I feel, I feel like it needs like it fades to that pure black like within the background, and I feel like that needs to be bumped. If it's going to be a solid color, it needs to be not necessarily pure black to stand off from what's outside of the walls, basically. If otherwise, I would suggest maybe just a subtle, texture on it, sort of similar to the brick texture you saw in the interior environment, with that same sort of tone.
Like even one highlight color, even one highlight color catching the edges of a stone texture.
Exactly, it could be as simple as that, right?
It would just really help keep this from getting too flat and from matching too much, like you said, these sort of completely solid voided areas here, which work very well for sort of parts of the map you're never going to get into that are just solid stone. But this is a background element. This should have some level of texture. And it's made worse, I think, by the fact that the fog effect makes everything fairly bright.
Right.
Until it gets into the central area, and then it gets very close to pure black.
I think it might be maybe like a touch lighter than black, but I think that's just due to the fog effect. I don't know if it's actually built into the.
And don't get us wrong, like this is definitely getting into a matter of taste and sensibility. Like I said, older farts like myself and Corey, we're going to be more sensitive to like the sort of combining of graphical effects and elements from totally different eras of classic gaming. We're going to feel like it's a more jarring juxtaposition, whereas a lot of younger people who have grown up playing a lot of retro style games that weren't forced to follow those hard rules of technical constraints of the actual hardware of the old consoles, they're going to be less sensitive to it. But still, it's just important that if you decide you're going to have like a 16-bit general style with these overlaid 24-bit effects, be consistent and just be careful that it goes well together. In general, this fog effect and everything, it does work fine. It's just you have it, and you have a lot of it suddenly in this one level. So see if you can do simple things like, just as one of the examples was, there's the torches I mentioned before. In the caves, you have these cute little they're almost like a cross between a light bug and a toad. Like they've got these bulbous light bulbs, and they're flying, and they emit light. Let's see if I can. There's one there.
Yep.
So those are really
it's got
cute.
The glow around it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's got this 24-bit alpha blended glow around it. It's hard to skip around in this, but you get the point. If they have that glow, then candles and stuff like that should handle their glow in the same way. And I noticed earlier in the game, there were these pickup items that were I think they were pickup items. They were like this blue magical thing, there they are. That blue flame-like thing that just appeared. That thing right there. I would keep that exactly as it is, but I would put a faint blue circular glow behind the entire thing. And it would just look really pretty, and it would tie in. Like, if you're going to keep those 24-bit style effects, then make it consistent. If something is emitting light and it has a glow, then everything that's emitting light, like a blue flame or a candle flame, should similarly emit that glow. And then, like, so here you have the waterfall. You know, mist is the same exact sort of aesthetic as a glow. So it's a little bit contradictory to have completely opaque animated waterfalls. Let's see. A little hard to jump around and find the right moment here. Yeah, there's one on screen. So here they are. You notice they're 100% opaque. So if you're going to have all this semi-transparent stuff, 24-bit glowy stuff, then it makes a lot of sense for this stuff to have semi-transparent pixels as well to make it really look diffused and misty. Because you've already established mist is 24-bit, right? So this is water, basically water mist, same thing. So it should also be treated in that same way. So definitely I would suggest doing that for all glows, but at this similarly there's that monster, if I can find it. I forget where it was. Was that in the swamp, or do you remember where that fairly big monster with the club was, Corey? Maybe it was near the end. Maybe it was like sort of a boss fight type thing. It's a long enough video where it's hard to scrub through and find the exact thing that. Oh, here he is. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So here we have a big monster, and you'll notice when he attacks, he's about to attack now. I'm going to slow down the playback speed. So there he has a big motion blur. The motion blur is completely opaque the whole way through. If you have 24-bit, and that's an established thing, and it's in a lot of places in some levels, then throughout the entire game, motion blur should probably be 24-bit, or at the very least it should transition. Like, motion blur is like it's like time travel, so to speak, visually, right? It's like a single frame that captures many frames in time. So the blur should be opaque down here or very close to it. And then as you get further and further toward the old part of the streak, it should get more and more transparent. And that would make a lot more sense for how motion blurs would be handled in a game that can do 24-bit effects all over the screen. So it's just that matter of consistency. Figure out what are the limitations, that the rules that you are imposing for cohesivity. Cohesivity makes things better. It's kind of like, and this might be a really controversial opinion, but this is in my opinion what makes poetry and songs that actually rhyme more pleasing than ones that don't, right? Like, when you set rules, it creates an inherent comfort and familiarity, right? So if you seem to be setting one rule for many minutes of your game, and then suddenly that rule is being broken a lot, it can be jarring. And it can make the earlier levels look unfinished, or the later level look like it wasn't under the same art direction or something. Like, it can... Go ahead.
And I would say too, and I know this is more of an art critique, but that applies to gameplay as well. You know, like
very true.
You know how back in the day people would design like the notorious water level, like in Ninja Turtles, where it's like you're playing this nice platformer, and then you're suddenly having to do a timer and defuse these bombs in a underwater level that plays unlike anything you did before. You know,
was this for the 8-bit Nintendo, I assume you're talking about?
Yes, yes. But there were lots of games that would throw some random gameplay element in there that was inconsistent with everything that came before, and it was very jarring. So keep that in mind, not just for the art, but for the rules of the game as well.
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
you designed it.
underwater is a good one that very few games get right. One of the worst examples I could think of. And remember, this is a matter to a large degree of personal taste, but
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
good thing to keep in mind, right? If you can keep this in mind and go, does this break things? Is this going to be jarring to people? Is this like sort of against the overall idea of the game? Like the one that I first noticed very much so, just as a casual game player or a console hardcore game player, but just I was not a professional game creator at that moment, was in my teens when Sonic the Hedgehog first came out. And clearly the whole marketing for the game was, the whole premise of the game was, you go fast, right?
Yes.
So then you hit your
Processing.
first water level, right? Then you hit your first water level, and now you're slow. But wait, you're not just slow. There's this ridiculous level of stress to slowly find the next air bubble so you don't drown to death.
Yeah, even to the point of having to sit and wait for them, like just
Right,
stand there.
right. Again, like
And,
just slow. Now, like the game that's all about going fast, now it's the opposite. But is that opposite way fun? Or just stressful? Does it really offer new gameplay, or does it just slow down and frustrate the existing gameplay? And I would argue that Sonic in the water just slows down and frustrates the existing gameplay, whereas Super Mario, when they introduced water and they introduced that swimming mechanic, the gameplay was still every bit or pretty much every bit as fast, just different, and in a nice way that broke up the potential monotony of just running everywhere. Sonic still controlled like he was not in water, except for the gravity change and the buoyancy. He still couldn't swim. So it was just slowing down and slightly changing and making much more like annoying and stressful in a non. It wasn't a pleasant way to, in my opinion. This is a matter of opinion, but it's good to ask yourself these questions and then obviously make your design decisions based on your own taste, but keep these sort of ideas in mind.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like nothing about this game in particular that we're looking at here felt that way at all.
Oh no, not at all.
It was very
Not
consistent with the gameplay.
Right.
And it looks very fun. I mean, it looks looks very engaging, you know.
Yeah.
But
and very charming. And again,
yeah.
like I did not ask to make a feedback video for this game because I thought the game looked bad. It's the opposite. I thought it looked so charming, and these few little fast like color tweaks and things like that could really just give it that next level of polish and make it even more charming and pleasant. So, but it's just an interesting concept to keep in mind, this sense of like in general we understand this idea of brand recognition, right? And we tend to think of it purely from a marketing standpoint. But the fact is that this sense, creating this sense of familiarity and being consistent with the aesthetic that represents your brand, or in this case, the aesthetic that represents the entire game, is really important, and it can make a game so much more endearing. It's one of the aspects that makes a game a classic. Like if every level of Super Mario 3 looked like it was done by different art teams that made very different choices, and some levels were nice and some were less nice and stuff like that, that would be a massive hit to the overall pleasant sort of sensation that playing the game and just experiencing the game creates. So it's a really important thing that not a lot of people give enough consideration to. Consistency. Set a rule, stick with that rule, and if you're going to break the rule, make sure that the payoff for breaking that rule is worth the potential hit to overall sense of quality or familiarity that you otherwise would have if you did not break the rule.
Yeah, and one thing to mention here on this, like if you're wanting to do a sort of fog-like effect in this cave, and it looks like it's not drawn in front of the foreground.
Right.
Like it's only in the background elements,
Right.
which is kind of cool, by the way. I
Right.
think that's better.
Right.
You can actually simulate a 16-bit like fog if you want to look at games that are a good example. Like look at something like the forest level in like the Super Nintendo Zelda Link to the Past.
Right.
Had a nice sort of scrolling fog that would kind of go over everything.
Right.
And you could use a similar effect. You actually break up the fog a little bit into its bunchy areas and then scroll it across really slowly.
And there's a hand-drawn element to it.
Right. So like something like that would add a lot more flavor, I think, to the fog effect as opposed to it just being this sort of easy, simple fade. I mean, and it's not horrible. It's just, that's like if you do want that 16-bit aesthetic, take a look at some of those games and how they do
Super
it.
Metroid, Zelda on the Super Nintendo. I think there's some foggy levels in Super Castlevania for the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, there's various games that
but in general, if you're going to stick purely 16-bit in style, then it's basically more pixel art hand-drawn, just made a certain degree of semi-transparent, just like the water that you've already established here. But I definitely would recommend giving it that lighter highlight color at the top. At the top edge of the water, it's going to add a lot. And then, if you're capable of having pretty much an unlimited number of sprites or whatever, having little water bubbles come up, randomly in the water could look really cool. Like that's a very minor little bit of extra polish you can add if you want to. But in general, the more you add 24-bit effects, and if you want it to be done well, the more you have to sort of take those extra steps to make sure everything that should be 24-bit looking is 24-bit looking. The other option is to take more time with such effects and do them the 16-bit way, which is more hand-drawn pixel art on its own layer that's a specific level of semi-transparency. But that's it in general. I did want to talk about, speaking of consistency and how that maintains breaking consistency just inherently makes something feel less quality. So one thing I wanted to mention is in the portraits here, let me see if I can find the portrait of the main character. That was the first portrait I saw, and it was the one I liked the most. So here she is, right? Oops. What's going on here? What is going on? I let go of the button and then it switches to, look at that.
You boomer.
Yep, exactly. I'm still in low speed too.
No,
so there it is. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. So so here is her portrait, and look at the nice size of the important part, the face, right? It takes up most of the space of the portrait, and then you get the classical bust where you only see the top of the shoulders and the face, and that looks great. It's got some lean to it. It's dynamic because of the hair. She's very expressive. She's looking right at the viewer. That portrait looks great. Then you go to her portrait, the other woman, and suddenly her whole head is smaller because more room was given needlessly to a very undetailed part of her character design. So I would highly recommend making sure, again, it's that consistency thing. If you've established with the portrait of the main character, which also looks better, it's a good rule to follow, crop more of the body out, just to have the top of the shoulders and the head, and that way the portrait can be bigger and nicer, and that way it's consistent when you're swapping between characters. She's a bigger, taller character. If anything, her head should be bigger, not smaller. So that's the other thing I suggest there. And the other thing too is, like I said, yes, the posture should reflect the personality of the character, but you see how lively that one is, and this one feels much more stiff and lifeless. And that might be her personality, but even if it were, there might be ways to pull that off in a more lively way, in a more dynamic way, like the player character's portrait. It just looks much better, even though there's nothing wrong artistically. Like it's not like it's done poorly, but just that break in the rule and the fact that that made the head smaller, those sorts of things just made it a less appealing portrait. And seeing that change in that unspoken rule, just inherently, just when there's not cohesive, when things are not cohesive, that's a sign of less than perfect quality, basically.
Right, and it's just made very apparent because the portraits appear in the exact same spot.
That's very true.
It just
very
swaps
true.
right between the other one.
Right.
And so if that's going to be the case, it's like definitely make sure they've got the same sort of zoom on the character's face and everything.
Right. That was an idea you had
help.
mentioned when we discussed the game before recording the video. This video is what there are some other potential ways to handle this. Again, this goes back to keeping things consistent. In the opening scene of the game, presumably because here it is, it's on the left. Oh, so okay, so it looks like prompts from the game are centered, and dialogue is on the left. Which they did set themselves up a rule. It's not something I'm used to. So
it feels a bit arbitrarily on the left.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I get it. Like, it's obvious here in this scene where the characters are kind of shifted to the bottom, and I assume this is because of the way the map is built.
Right.
In this particular scene, it's like, oh yeah, you could easily say, well, just move that dialogue box to the middle.
Right.
But in a later scene, the characters are more shifted to the center.
Right.
And it would be covering the characters, but one way you could fix this is, there's all that HUD up there, which obviously is necessary for the gameplay, but you could temporarily remove it for dialogue scenes. To get that text box a little higher up, and you could potentially center it at that point.
Right, make the camera center things more so that the right.
Yeah, and it's not so much that it's inconsistent so much as like it feels like for example right here, the woman you're talking to is on your right over here, and her portrait is so far removed from her, like over there in that far left facing the other way.
It clear communication. Clear communication. Like the first thing I saw when I saw her portrait, the player's portrait on the left, I immediately assumed when the other woman who was on the right was going to start talking that this portrait would disappear entirely, this dialogue box, and another dialogue box would appear on the right with her portrait on the right, on the right, and then the text to the left of it here. So you got this really natural, she's here, she's on the left, her portrait and her dialogue is on the left. When it's this character's turn, it's her portrait on the right because she's on the right, and her text right here. That would communicate more clearly what's going on, because at a glance, just for the screen, people are going to think, why is this on the left? Oh, that's her. But wait a minute, that doesn't look like her, that looks like her.
Right.
So it might be worth considering, and another option is to just make the text, the dialogue box, when it appears, make it centered, but go across like almost the whole screen, which gives you more room for text, so you potentially have less needs for button prompts for fairly lengthy dialogue, and you could potentially make the portrait bigger and have the portrait appear on the left for the character on the left and on the right for the character on the right, but keep the box consistent. So that could work really well too. And not that this is terrible, it works, but those are other things to consider that might be more clear communication, which is always a good thing. And ironically, consistency doesn't just mean within your own game. If certain what's the word? Certain patterns are established in video games. Like some of this stuff is ancient. Like most of the time in a platformer, in most levels, you want to go from left to right. You know what I mean? Like it feels weird. Imagine a whole game where you're always going from right to left. Right?
Yeah, that would be strange.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're going Like, if you're going to break a fairly consistent rule that's been established in games for years or decades that, like, everyone is used to, kind of like button mapping, like games that mix up the jump with the attack button on classic console games. Like, it drives people nuts, especially if they can't go into an option and swap those buttons out. Like, once, like, the first million platformer games, especially the classic ones like Mario, establish jump and attack a certain way, especially in a certain console, really decide, is there a reason I'm breaking this rule? Like, is it worth it to make so many people uncomfortable because it's not what they are comfortably used to, and what is just sort of like, there are certain things in video games that don't make any sense and are kind of funny, like wall meat in Castlevania, or in fighting games like Final Fight. Everyone is just used to, like, somehow shattering a metal trash can, which makes no sense to begin with. But then there's a nice, fresh, steaming turkey dinner on a plate. And of course you're going to eat that steaming trash turkey. And of course, not only would you eat the trash turkey, but of course that's going to instantaneously replenish your health, right? It makes no sense, but it's so established. If you're going to make that style of game, you need to think long and hard. Yes, that's goofy. But as soon as you make a decision, and I was actually having this debate recently, conceptualizing such a game, if we want to make the game more serious, we could make medikits hidden in certain things. But does it make much more sense for, like, a high-tech medical kit, like first aid kit, to be in the trash? Does that really make much more sense? And then visually, is it going to be as appealing, and is it going to communicate so readily to people who have been playing these sorts of games their whole lives, who are used to the trash meat, the trash turkey? You know what I mean? So make those decisions carefully. Am I breaking convention for a really compelling reason that is going to add value to the game and make the play experience more fun, even though I'm forcing them to get used to something that is not what they're used to? Is it worth it? That's just a common question to ask yourself. And again, like, this is something that I would get used to incredibly quickly. So I'm definitely not saying you've got to change this is terrible, but those are things to consider that could make it even better and more comfortable for people that have played a lot of games.
Yeah, we say this as people who have, like, had to make these sort of design decisions like a million times, and for various reasons. And yeah, we like, I kind of get it. Like, in this case, like, I get with the characters sometimes being in the center of the screen vertically, why that decision was made. Oh, we'll just shift this box over here,
and it could look claustrophobic, if you just center this right now as things are, it could look like, it looks weird. Everything important is right in the center, and then everything around it is not that important.
Yeah, so it takes some time to find the right balance for what you want. But also, be mindful, like, always, if you see other games that are doing similar things as yours, don't hesitate to see what they're doing and see what works and what doesn't work. Pick out the things that you're like, oh, that doesn't work too well, and then if the game, like, really impresses you, like, figure out why, and not saying copy people necessarily, but
there's no harm in that. There's a difference between
out or a design like that. There's nobody's going to care if you take inspiration.
Yeah, there's a big difference between copying and stealing, right? So, like, if there's a really original idea for gameplay or a character design or something like that, and you just, like, totally copy that, you're stealing, right? If there's dialogue for a game that's done very similarly in all the, like, AAA games of the past, and you do it the same way, you're not stealing something. You're following a convention of an important but mundane aspect of just games in general. Exactly. You're just not defying convention for an arbitrary reason. And of course, if you can improve on it somehow, that's great. But if you're going to defy convention and make people to some degree a little confused or uncomfortable, then really consider, is it worth it? Is there a payoff I know that exists that makes it worth the price? But anyway, I could repeat myself forever, apparently. But that's the I think that's pretty much everything that we wanted to cover from a like gameplay looks great. It looks really charming. There's clearly a lot of personality.
Yeah.
These subplot, this sort of what are they called? Mini games going on. These side quests are looking really cute. Cute. I mean that in a very non-condescending way, like really charming, and and none of them look like they're gonna take too long.
Even this run animation with the character kind of like throwing her arms back.
The Naruto run is what I call it.
Yes, it's very nice. It's very it gives her so much personality.
Yeah.
So lots of really charming aspects, especially to this main character. I love the little part in the cave where she gets like the book power up. I think it's around 9 minutes and 30 seconds around that point.
All right, let's take a look. All right, let's see if we could find this here.
And she, you think in a traditional game you get a power up, you just get it.
Right.
This character actually kind of takes a second to like read the book and
then celebrate.
And celebrates
that she learned a new thing. That's awesome.
It's very, very nice.
Yeah. It's those kinds it's those kind of touches and attention to detail and subtlety to sort of really make you empathize with this character and feel a sense of this world is really what attracted me to this game. And just seeing the initial environment and seeing the obvious like tiny bit of information that hopefully that I conveyed to this artist and this team that can really like I'm really interested in playing this game when it's done and seeing its progress. It's really looking great, and it's definitely right in line with so many of the great classic games, some of my favorite games that I played and still love to play. So it's really looking great. I think that's all the I'll just really quickly go to the image folder and see if there's any like really sort of obvious thing that we could discuss. I'll switch this to really large thumbnails so we could see. So those are before and afters. That's the same outdoor environment. Did you want to take a look at this outdoor architecture? We didn't give any feedback on that. I have no idea if there's any worth giving, but all right. So I mean, obviously the same exact color rules. Make sure shadowed colors are bluer. Look here how we've got the shadowed side of this building. Yet it's browner than the lit parts of the building. That's the opposite of what should be happening.
Right.
And
exactly.
that flattens the sense of depth. The other thing, again, keep in mind, when you look at a structure, this is especially true for walls and floors, and so many artists make this mistake. A floor or a wall in a game, especially a 2D game, you should get the soft sense of floor. Even if it's an interesting floor like stone floor in a dungeon, in your mind, it should just be like, oh, stone door in a stone floor in a dungeon. What should not happen is each specific stone yelling at you. And when you have a really bright highlight edge and a really dark outline separating each stone or brick, suddenly you're seeing the whole structure, but it's being ripped apart psychologically, and every last stone is yelling at you for attention. I'm a stone. So what you really need to do is you want the planes of the overall structure to be emphasized. So I would make the shadows even darker, the shadow planes, the shadow sides, darker and bluer. Make the planes that are definitely catching strong highlight overall brighter and warmer and sharper contrast, but not with such super high reflected edge like rim lighting on each brick. That's just
if you shifted the tones where it was cooler in the dark and warmer in the light, tone down that rim a little bit on the stones.
Right.
See, you can see up there at the top where the windows are, that sort of brownish flat wall there, like it does get pretty dark on that side up there.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So if the same thing was happening with the stones, like you would definitely feel the shape of that building.
Right.
I mean, and generally, I like the look of this building.
Yeah,
Like, I think
the
it's pretty
design
cool
is
looking.
great. It's just
and
the
I love
shading
all of
isn't
the
doing it
extra,
justice.
the extra foliage sort of added to it, like the vines and things.
Right.
Gives it character. But yeah, it's really just again similar to what we talked about before. Just a matter of really nailing those tones and.
Right. So you could see, for
and
now,
values,
I've just brightened the highlight plane and darkened the shadowed sides, especially darkened and made bluer the extreme shadow. And look how we're already starting to get a much better sense of the actual form of the overall structure. And it's starting to become the overall structure instead of each brick shouting at you that it's a brick. And then the last point, like, this seems like a fairly important protruding aspect to this architecture. So I would definitely, all right, that's darkening. I would brighten this whole thing. And I'm doing this in a really sloppy way, but hopefully it's good enough to get the point across. I would brighten that whole thing.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
And then I would cast a stronger shadow under it and do the same thing here, but more subtly. I'm not going to do it more subtly because that would take me time to do the settings change. But you could see, again, we're worried about the structure and the interesting aspects of the structure instead of having really high contrast on particular things. So now the last bit here is, let's do the same thing with this with this doorway. Let's really pop the frame around the door. And then there's a problem with that door itself. It is perfectly flush with the surface of the brick. I would definitely suggest, and the steps, that's a good opportunity to bring those out even further. So look at, now we're getting structure. Now we're getting a real sense of depth to the whole structure. And then, so what I would do is grab this. Let's see.
Yeah, you can just inset that a little bit.
And we're going to inset that. Oops, I'm in semi-transparent mode apparently.
And you got a nice like border of stones around it.
Right, exactly. So we're going to do this. Why am I getting semi-transparent? Oh, I'm in dither mode. Okay. Mode. How do you turn off dither?
Ghost door. Yeah, you've established that.
Where is the dither mode? I'm forgetting how you turn it on and off, unfortunately. Is it Shift F2? Yep, Shift F2. Okay.
Man, learn how to use ProMotion.
Yeah,
I mean,
really. I've only been using it like 20 years.
No, like I don't even know half of the features, to be honest with you. There are a lot. I remember discovering the dither mode the other day, and I was like, "Oh, that's really awesome!"
Oh, there's some really cool stuff you can do with that.
I just haven't found a great time to use it, but it's exactly. Like it's cool that it's there, you know.
Yeah. So I'm not going to take the time to make this really nice, but I think it'll get the point across here. Get the brick going there, and then so you could already see how much more form and depth. And then the last thing we need to do is just cast that shadow on the top of the door. So mode brightness, and then and you can even do an angle to give it a little more interest. So, and again, the highlight on this door is way too strong. You don't want every board of the door to be fighting with the door. You want the door to be made out of boards. So really kill the brightness of that highlight. And then you will have a door, not a bunch of boards. Oh, and we got to do that.
And keep in mind, there were a lot of old 8-bit games, on the NES and things like the Master System, where you would catch these really strong highlights in places
Right.
where it seemed like maybe that was intentional from an art standpoint.
Right.
But these people were working with very limited color palettes that had set values, and they couldn't
Right.
adjust them. So a lot of times these people would just make the best compromise to pull off the look they had. So remember that sometimes you might want that strong highlight to give it maybe the classic feel that you're going for, but you don't have to when you've got all of this great color range available to you.
Right.
You can be a little more subtle with your stuff. And yeah, I mean, this building is already looking like it's just got a lot more shape and depth and lighting.
So
I mean, obviously it would have to be finely done within the pixel art, but
not hacked like I just did. But you can see here. So we're gonna do here's before, and here's after. So you can see the overall architecture here, although a great design, feels very flat. Yet every brick is fighting for attention. And then now the bricks themselves aren't fighting for attention, and the overall structure is becoming much more like the coolness of the design now is being emphasized instead of de-emphasized. So, oh, and then speaking of this specific screenshot, take a look at the smoke again. This was the perfect opportunity. This is early in the game. 24-bit fire, 24-bit glowing, 24-bit mist. Yet here you have smoke, and it's not only completely solid like it's 8-bit or like 16-bit systems that had no translucency effects, but it's even got a black outline or nearly black outline on it, which makes it look even more contradictory to what you end up doing all over the place in that later level. So make sure that stuff is consistent. Figure out which way you want to go and stick with it throughout the entire game. That sense of consistency is a massive part of why some games just feel really AAA in their overall quality, is consistency, following the rules they establish for the style and aesthetic of the game. So I know we repeated ourselves a lot on this point, but it's a really important point that most people don't give anywhere near enough. Most teams don't give.
And I will say, I do appreciate, like with this building in particular, I do appreciate how when you go inside of it, like the structure on the inside feels like the structure on the outside. Like you get the stone going up, and then you have the upper level that's got all the wood in it. It looks the same, and that's a nice attention to detail that I think really gives it.
Again, it's related. It's a sense of consistency, not surprising people in arbitrary ways, right? Things need to feel like they make sense. Things need to not be jarring. You establish a style, you stick to it. In this case, you established, hey, I'm going to go into this architecture. If you went into it and it was like, Snoopy's doghouse, like it's a giant mansion inside somehow, or Oscar the Grouch's can, which they did a similar gag, I think. If you're going to do that, it's got to be for a specific reason, like a shock gag, you know what I mean?
Right.
But anyway, in general, figure out your rules, figure out the very specific aesthetic you're going for, and be consistent. Anyway, I've said it for the billionth time now. But I mean, I think that's about it. I think that was even like the last image or among them, aside from the stuff that we already covered, the sort of swamp and cave area quite well during the video. So I think we should wrap it up. That's really, the game is looking fantastic. And it is again called Cricket from the Stars. And in the description of the video, I'll be linking to the website and social media so that you can get more info and keep up to date on its progress. But I wish the team a lot of... I'll
definitely be following along to see how this goes.
I'm definitely excited to play
it's cool.
All right. Thanks again, Corey, so much for taking part in this awesome game art review, and there will be more to come, everyone. Anybody out there, if you're working on a pixel art retro style game, feel free to contact us and show us your game, and if we have the time and if there's you know, like this case in this game, there were some really specific ideas that immediately came to mind that I thought would be really useful for people to know. So send us your links to your games if you would like some feedback, and we'll see what we can do. So that's
Yeah,
it.
and it doesn't
Yep.
always have to be in video format either. If you're just
Right.
looking for any sort of feedback at all, you
Right,
know.
screenshots, individual sprites or sprite sheets or animations if you want feedback on a particular animation for your game. Any pixel art that you would like some feedback on by two, you know, like 10-year pro pixel artists, or 10-year plus, then by all means, if you think we provided some useful feedback for this game, then we welcome you to send us stuff if you would like feedback on your own projects. So anyway, thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned. Subscribe if you want to be notified when more videos like this are made. So thanks again. If you like these projects and videos, and you'd like to help them get finished and released faster and at an even higher quality, then please consider becoming a Patreon backer. I'll do my best to make the entire creation process as entertaining and educational as possible during the entire development process, with frequent live streams, videos, and progress updates. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel, BitBeamCannon, to stay up to date on everything I'm working on, and help spread the word by liking and sharing. I really appreciate your support.